March 24th, 2011. NATO launched Operation Unified Protector in Libya, claiming it was conducted under the responsibility to protect civilians from Gaddafi's regime. But soon what was framed as a humanitarian intervention turned into a full-blown regime change, leaving Libya in chaos. This isn't an isolated case. There are growing accusations that powerful nations have frequently used R2P to advance their geopolitical agendas under the guise of protecting human rights. But how did we get here? How did a principle meant to safeguard the vulnerable become a tool for political manipulation? To understand this, we need to comprehend the concept of sovereignty, an idea that's far more than just about borders. In this video, we'll dive into the chronicles of sovereignty, from the Westphalian model to the highly contentious concept of conditional sovereignty. By the end of this video, I hope you will have a clear understanding of how these principles have shaped our world and continue to influence modern geopolitics. So, let's begin. A sovereign state is a term used in international politics to describe any independent country with control over its internal and external affairs, regardless of a country's size, whether as vast as Russia or as tiny as Monaco, or its population density, whether as crowded as India or as sparse as Iceland. The concept of sovereignty holds the same significance. This principle is referred to as sovereign equality. It is a fundamental tenet of international law, meaning all states have equal rights and responsibilities, regardless of size or population. However, in the 21st century, some states have transformed into failed states or fragile states, while some other have become satellite states, largely due to the vulnerability of their sovereignty. Now comes the question of sovereignty's core components. Primarily, sovereignty has four fundamental elements. First of all, sovereignty is a permanent concept, meaning it lasts as long as the state exists and maintains the ability to control its territory and formulate foreign policies independently. Second, sovereignty is absolute and comprehensive, extending to every individual and corporation in the country. No entity within the country has authority over the state itself. Third, sovereignty is indivisible and inalienable. There can be no two entities controlling sovereignty, and the state's supremacy cannot be transferred from one entity to another. Fourth, sovereignty is an exclusive power, meaning it has no competitors within its territory. Now let's understand the concept of sovereignty from two distinct perspectives. First perspective is Westphalian sovereignty. This concept derives from the 1648 Peace of Westphalia Treaty, which ended conflicts in Europe by asserting that states have supreme authority within their borders and that no other state should interfere in their internal affairs. This principle is the foundation of modern international relations, combining aspects of both internal and external sovereignty. Let's comprehend these two concepts. Internal sovereignty refers to a state's ability to exercise supreme control over its territory, including the monopoly on the legitimate use of force and the ability to enforce laws without internal opposition. If any entity within the state holds more power than the government, it indicates that the state lacks full internal sovereignty. A real-world example is Somalia's struggle with the militant groups. Since the collapse of the central government in 1991, Somalia has faced challenges from several non-state actors, including Al-Shabaab, which is a hardcore terrorist organization that controls large portions of the country. The Somali government has been unable to fully suppress the group, which has imposed its own laws, carried out attacks, and undermined government authority. This demonstrates that Somalia lacks full internal sovereignty, as the government's authority is not enforced across its entire territory. On the other hand, external sovereignty comprises two components. First, a state must possess the necessary power to safeguard its borders against external invasions. For instance, although the West Bank and Gaza Strip are acknowledged by numerous international bodies as part of Palestine, they are currently under different levels of Israeli authority, indicating that Palestine lacks external sovereignty. Additionally, a sovereign state must possess the capacity to independently develop and implement its own foreign policy, free from external influences exerted by other governments. As an instance, the Federated States of Micronesia has a compact of free association with the United States. Under this agreement, while Micronesia is internally sovereign, its foreign policy and defense capabilities are heavily influenced by the United States, compromising its external sovereignty. Another perspective of sovereignty is conditional sovereignty. It is a relatively new and philosophically idealistic concept in international relations that challenges the traditional view of sovereignty. It suggests that sovereignty is not absolute, but subjected upon a state's ability to fulfill certain responsibilities, particularly the protection of human rights and the well-being of its citizens. According to this concept, if a state fails in these duties, external actors may have a moral or legal right to intervene. The idea contrasts with the traditional notion of Westphalian sovereignty, which holds that states have absolute authority within their borders and should not face external interference. An example of this concept is NATO's intervention in Kosovo in 1999. At the time, Kosovo was a province of Serbia, and NATO's actions violated Serbia's Westphalian sovereignty. However, NATO justified the intervention on humanitarian grounds, arguing it was necessary to prevent ethnic cleansing and massive human rights violations against the ethnic Albanian population in Kosovo. This aligns with the concept of conditional sovereignty, where the protection of human rights can justify breaching a state's sovereignty. From this notion of prioritizing humanitarian concerns over absolute sovereignty emerges the modern concept of responsibility to protect, better known as R2P. The question now arises, what is this R2P? How does this relate to today's geopolitics? Let's dive into this. A heated debate was emerged in the international political arena at the beginning of this century over whether conducting humanitarian intervention in another nation undermines that nation's sovereignty. In 2001, Kofi Annan, who was then Secretary General of the United Nations, posed a crucial question. If humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to situations like Rwanda and Srebrenica, where gross and systematic human rights abuses have occurred? In response to such questions and the challenges posed by past atrocities, the Canadian government established the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty. The Commission aimed to define the concept of humanitarian intervention and introduced the term responsibility to protect. In 2005, during the World Summit, all UN member states formally endorsed the responsibility to protect as a legitimate framework for humanitarian intervention. The doctrine emphasized the protection of human rights in cases of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crime against humanity. These interventions must be conducted with respect for the sovereignty, peace, security, and adherence to international law of the state in question. Responsibility to protect stands upon three vital pillars, each representing a step in safeguarding humanity from its darkest atrocities. The first pillar, states' protection responsibilities, is where it all begins. Here, the state holds the primary duty to shield its people from the horrors of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. But what happens when this promise falters, when a state finds itself incapable of fulfilling its duty? That is where the second pillar, international assistance and capacity building, steps in. The international community, bound by a shared humanity, offers its hand. Neighboring nations and global institutions unite, not in judgment, but in support. They provide resources, expertise, and aid, strengthening the state's ability to protect its people and helping it rise from the brink of failure. However, There are times when even this assistance is not enough, when a state, despite all efforts, cannot stop the tide of human rights violations. Sometimes state machinery itself involves in these crimes. Then the third pillar, timely and decisive collective response, comes into play. Here the international community must act to protect the innocent, but no longer passive observers. Sovereignty, though deeply respected, cannot stand in the way when lives are at stake. In this way, the responsibility to protect framework unites the principles of sovereignty and human rights, reminding the world that while each state governs itself, it is part of a greater whole, bound by the duty to protect all people from the gravest of crimes. However, critics argue that in some cases, R2P has been used as a pretext for advancing geopolitical agendas rather than solely protecting civilians. To illustrate this, let's analyze one geopolitical incident where global powers are alleged to have taken this concept too far, using interventions framed as humanitarian but arguably driven by other objectives. This highly contentious incident occurred in 2011, when NATO launched a military intervention in Libya during the civil uprising against Muammar Gaddafi's regime. The intervention was framed within the responsibility to protect doctrine, which aims to prevent mass atrocities such as genocide and war crimes. The initial mission was to enforce a no-fly zone and protect civilians from attacks by Gaddafi's forces. However, as the intervention progressed, its focus expanded beyond civilian protection and increasingly shifted towards removing Gaddafi from power. After Gaddafi's removal, Libya quickly descended into chaos, leading to political instability and the emergence of various militias. Since the 2011 intervention, Libya has remained mired in a state of enduring instability, with multiple civil wars and frequent clashes between various armed factions. Libyan oil production plummeted from 1.65 million barrels per day in 2010 to less than 500,000 barrels in the years following the intervention, contributing to economic collapse and worsening living conditions for ordinary Libyans. The Global Terrorism Index reported that Libya had become one of the most volatile countries in the world by 2014, with militant groups using the country as a base for operations across North Africa and the Middle East. Critics argue that NATO's intervention, initially justified as a humanitarian mission, quickly turned into an operation focused on regime change rather than genuine humanitarian protection. Rather than the protection of civilians, the removal of Gaddafi became the de facto goal of the mission, which leads to long-term instability. Libya has become a cautionary tale about the risks of misusing humanitarian interventions for political purposes, leaving behind a legacy of violence, political fragmentation, and human suffering. Thus, the misuse of the R2P concept under the guise of humanitarian intervention continues in today's world. That's all for today. I hope this video helped you gain a comprehensive understanding of the dilemmas surrounding sovereignty in modern geopolitics. Those of you who watched this video all the way to the end, I am obliged to you. Thank you for your time and support.